Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name is Sabra Lane. I am the club's president. I'm also the presenter of the ABC radio program AM. Today's guest is the Deputy Labor Leader and Shadow Defence Minister Richard Marles. Mr Marles has driven up from Victoria, gaining strict exemption to deliver this address here today, and we thank you very much for that. It also says something about how important you think it is to be here to give this address today. We're holding this event under strict COVID rules. If you're following the conversation online, you'll find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAUST. Please, everybody, welcome Richard Marles.
Well, thank you, Sabra. Can I start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet? I'd like to acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues Alicia Payne and Dave Smith, and in particular my parliamentary colleague and good friend, the Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese. And let me also start by saying, yes, I am a Victorian, and yes, I am in Canberra. My home state is experiencing a disaster right now, and believe it or not, I cannot wait to go back. But democratic government is at the heart of our ability to fight the coronavirus. It builds the state capacity that funds healthcare and carries the public confidence necessary to enable the difficult decisions that we have seen in Victoria over the last few days be able to be made. Our system of democracy has continued through the most difficult of times, and it's essential that it does so now. And so I've followed every health protocol and more in order to be here today to hold the Morrison Government to account and raise a critically important matter for our nation. There are two great conceits of Conservative governments. First, they will always be better at managing the economy, and second, they will always be better on national security. Just as tariffs produced protectionism in the economy, which hindered productivity, these conceits are a kind of political protectionism, which have always bred in the Liberal Party a political laziness, and in the case of the Morrison Government, complete ineptitude. The conceit's obviously not true. Australia's economy today was built by the Hawke and Keating Labor governments and their commitment to dismantling the Compact of Federation. The unprecedented period of economic growth that Australia experienced up until this year has been first and foremost an achievement of a reforming Labor government. And when it comes to national security, it was the Fisher Labor government which gave Australia its navy, the Curtin Labor government which dragged Australia out of complacency and put us in a state of readiness to fight the Second World War, and the Chifley Labor government which established ASIO. More recently, the existing strategic paradigm which underpins the 2016 Defence White Paper finds its origins in the 1986 DIB report and the subsequent 1987 Defence White Paper, which was a product of Defence Minister Kim Beazley and the Hawke Labor government. While Labor has been focused on substantive reform of the economy and national security to the benefit and protection of all Australians, the Liberals have been focused on their own brand and deploying it as a powerful electoral weapon only benefiting themselves. The truth is that the heavy lifting in both economic management and national security in this country has been done by Labor. And right now, both our economy and our national security are languishing badly under the Morrison Government. Even before COVID-19, when Australians take a serious look at their economic situation, can they honestly say they were better off at the end of 2019 than they were in 2013 when the Liberals took office? Now, there are some in the commentariat who say that amid this crisis the Prime Minister is doing a good job. But is he? Is he really? Is this government managing our economy and our national security in a way which will see Australia move into the middle of this century prosperously with a sense of optimism and confidence? A case study of the Morrison Government's incompetence has been its handling of the Future Submarine Program. The Future Submarine Program has been of concern to the defence community for many years. But there are two key reasons why this story should be on the radar of every Australian. First, the Future Submarines are the single most expensive item that the Commonwealth of Australia has ever purchased in any context since Federation. And second, Australia's national security desperately requires the evolution of its long-range submarine capability. Why submarines are so important is not immediately obvious. Submarines are a highly complex and versatile piece of equipment. They can engage in surveillance, they can be lethal, they can perform a wide range of functions and duties, but most significantly, they have stealth. Everything that a submarine does can be done in a way which is undetected. Australia having the power to deploy this capability with its lethality a long way from our shores is the single biggest question mark that we can place in any adversary's mind. So when we buy a submarine, we buy that question mark. They are a powerful deterrent. And more than any other military platform that Australia has today, submarines can shape our strategic circumstances in a way which empowers our nation and gives Australia sovereignty. Before the coronavirus struck, Australia was facing its most complicated strategic circumstances since the Second World War. But COVID has been an accelerant on difficult trends which were already in play. COVID has given rise to greater instability within our region and the world. COVID has created questions to which there are no answers, and this has raised our strategic challenge to an entirely different level. And so the need for future submarines, which help meet this challenge, has quite simply never been greater. Australia's current long-range submarine capability is performed by the Collins-class submarines. They were initiated by the Hawke Labor government in June of 1987. The designing and building of these submarines is one of the great achievements of the Australian defence industry. After a number of years of poor service during the Howard government, the Gillard Labor government initiated the Coles review process, which saw the Collins class so dramatically improve its operational availability that by 2016, John Coles described the Collins class as having graduated from, and I quote, mediocre to excellent in less than 4 years at almost level funding. Coles said further, a program once that was considered a project of concern should perhaps now be treated as an exemplar project if such a category existed. At their core, these reforms introduced the current highly successful sustainment arrangements for Collins that have ensured Navy's availability requirements for our nation's submarine capability can be finally met sustainably. The Collins-class submarines are doing an incredible job for our nation. However, these are submarines which were conceived in the 1980s. The first of the Collins-class submarines, HMAS Collins, was commissioned in July of 1996. The Collins class was designed with a theoretical platform life of 28 years, meaning it was originally intended that their end of life would start to occur in the decade that we are now in. A new class of submarines was therefore essential to evolve Australia's long-range submarine capability. And so in 2009, the Rudd Labor government announced that Australia would pursue a program of building 12 future submarines for our nation. With the election of the Abbott government in September of 2013, it became clear the ambition of building these submarines in Australia was not shared by the coalition government. In 2014, then Defence Minister David Johnson questioned the need for 12 new submarines. He raised fears of an overseas build. He then famously declared that ASC could not be trusted to build a canoe. Prime Minister Abbott sought to have the future submarines built in Japan in an attempt to close the deal on the Japan Free Trade Agreement. Then, at the beginning of 2015, the fate of Australia's Future Submarine Program was tossed around the government party room as part of the empty chair challenge on Prime Minister Tony Abbott. This mind-blowing act of indulgence made it clear that for the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government, the politics of survival completely trumped Australia's national interests and national security. Later that year, Defence Minister Kevin Andrews announced the submarine acquisition program and explicitly called for options around an overseas design and build. The indifference shown by the Liberals towards Australian defence industry was replicated in the rest of their defence procurement program. Tony Abbott sent the new Australian supply ship to be built in Spain. One could be forgiven for assuming the coalition government had an active aversion to Australian-built defence materiel. And this in turn reflected the coalition's view towards Australian industry more generally. In 2013, Joe Hockey told Holden, "Either you are here or you're not," and in the process began goading the Australian car industry to leave our shores. This actually came to fruition with the decision of Holden in December of 2013 to stop building cars in Australia, with Toyota following suit in 2014. Now, as the most complex form of manufacturing in Australia, the loss of the car industry had ramifications that reverberated throughout the entire manufacturing sector. In September of 2015, Malcolm Turnbull became the Prime Minister and Christopher Pyne became Industry Minister, and this heralded a change in tack. The political consequences of losing the car industry on its watch was not lost on Christopher Pyne. But coalition governments don't do activist industry policy because the Liberal Party is the party of government getting out of the way. Defence industry, however, where the client is the government, provided a unique opportunity for this Liberal government to intervene into the industry space. And thus, defence industry became the answer to the government's industry policy failures. Now, while Australia has many successful companies which engage in defence industry and many thousands of workers employed in that industry, as a nation, our defence industrial base is of the highest quality, but it is modest. We could and we should do much more. Yet there is no example in the world where a country has managed to build a significant defence industry void of a strategic rationale. A domestic defence industry needs to serve the defence force in a way which is competitive and economical. A national agenda to produce jobs and economic output, an industry policy, will not lead you to building this industrial capability as opposed to any other industrial capability. There needs to be some strategic rationale, not just political stopgaps. The Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government has never been able to articulate a strategic rationale for its defence industry policies, even though Labor believes that such a rationale most definitely exists. And this failure to develop a proper strategic rationale for establishing a defence industry in Australia has meant that Scott Morrison's attempt to pursue an Australian defence industry policy remains half-hearted. But that is a story for another day. One other step that was quickly taken by Christopher Pyne was to recommit building the Future Submarines in Adelaide. But given its recent history on this issue, the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government suffered from a major gap in credibility. As the 2016 election loomed, both Malcolm Turnbull and Christopher Pyne wanted to place beyond doubt their intent to build the 12 future submarines in Adelaide. And it's in this moment that a profound mistake was made. On 26 April 2016, Malcolm Turnbull and Christopher Pyne announced that not only would the 12 future submarines be built in Adelaide, but to prove it, they also announced the company which would build them, namely Naval Group. In a brazen effort to create a lot of hype and make the announcement sound convincing, for the biggest procurement in Australia's history, they down-selected to one company at a point in time before a design had even been done. Consider that. Rather than field healthy competition, they eliminated every other contender, giving one company full run of the field before the starting gun. In 2016, the estimated cost of the Future Submarine Program was $50 billion, $50,000 million. The design phase was anticipated to be in the order of $400 million. Now, with large defence procurement projects, the rule is that problems can be solved in the design phase with very little cost. But a problem in design, which makes its way into the physical build, costs an exponential amount of money to rectify at the back end of a program. So, to save money in the long run, you spend money up front. And in order to put some competitive tension into the spending of thousands of millions of dollars, it is worth it to pay for two designs and in the process create a competition for the best one. Literally every serious defence observer believes that the government down-selected the Future Submarine Program to one company in a way that was negligently premature. Instead, the design of the future submarines should have been the subject of competition, and in the process Australia would have maximised its bargaining power in respect of the biggest procurement spend we have ever made. Spending that additional $400 million up front would have saved tens of billions of dollars down the track. But the failure to compete the design has meant that from the very outset, Naval Group has been put in a position of supreme bargaining power, which in turn has enormously disadvantaged Australia in the management of this program. Now, on 4 March of this year, Ron Finlay AM, a member of the Naval Shipbuilding Advisory Board, put it very simply during Senate estimates, and I quote, "In my experience of many decades of negotiating major contracts, if you do not have an alternative either going to bidder B or cancelling the project, yes, you are captured in a negotiation with few options. That does increase the number of issues that can become a block to concluding the negotiations." The premature down selection to a single bidder was an epic fail. And the problems which have ensued in managing the Future Submarine Program have stemmed from this original massive mistake. Now, there have been enormous difficulties in maintaining the Future Submarine Program on its timetable. In 2015, Kevin Andrews said that the future submarines, and I quote, must be delivered in time to avoid a capability gap in the mid-2020s when the Collins-class submarine is scheduled to be retired from service. With the 2016 Defence White Paper, that timetable went out the window and the language changed to delivering the first of the future submarines in the early 2030s. The failure to compete the bid meant that negotiations with Naval around the conclusion of the key document, the Strategic Partnering Agreement, were delayed for 16 months. The Strategic Partnering Agreement was not signed until 11 February 2019. And then earlier this year, Defence confirmed that the first of the future submarines was expected to undergo test and evaluation between 2032 and 2034, meaning it will not be operational until around 2035. It is inevitable that the coronavirus will impact this timing even further. So let's be clear, in the last 7 years, the Future Submarine Program has slipped by 10 years. And now, Australia is faced with the dilemma of how to bridge the capability gap which is being created by the anticipated end of life of the Collins-class submarines. On 19 February 2015, Kevin Andrews said, and I quote, "The Future Submarine Program is the largest defence procurement program in Australia's history and represents an investment in the order of $50 billion in Australia's security." During Senate estimates at the time, this was confirmed to be a cost expressed in outturned dollars. That is, the actual amount of money that will be spent in the life of the program, with the value of each dollar being calculated in the year in which it is spent. This means that the figure should not change over time. Now, through the mist of much smoke and mirrors, it has now clearly emerged that the price tag for the Future Submarine Program has blown out to $90 billion in outturned dollars. Since Christopher Pyne and Malcolm Turnbull announced in 2016 that Naval Group would build the future submarines, the program cost has increased by 80%, and we are only 4 years into a 30-year program. This is not a cost blowout, this is a cost supernova. In 2016, with an election just months away, Christopher Pyne was in full hyperbolic flight saying, and I quote, "We are involved in a proper commercial negotiation with Naval as the builder of the submarine." He went on to declare that Naval has admitted that probably less than 10% of the work will be done outside Australia. Then, with the election well and truly in the rear-view mirror, Christopher was backpedalling so quickly he even risked spilling his gin and tonic. By April 2017, he was claiming a 90% local build, quote, was never the government's figure, and that he had always said, quote, a local build meant around 60% of the project. Come December 2018, with another election on the horizon, Christopher Pyne's optimism was returning. Quote, a local build is defined as being around 60% plus, he said, before declaring, I'm sure it'll be further north of 60%. But by the time the Strategic Partnering Agreement was signed, it became clear there is no contractual commitment to have any specific level of Australian industry content for the future submarines at all. The only commitment is to maximise Australian industry content, which ultimately means nothing. In February this year, with concerns over the program's Australian industry content reaching fever pitch, Defence Minister Linda Reynolds was forced to act and announced an undertaking from her French counterpart that Naval Group was committed to a level of Australian industry capability of at least 60% of the contract value spent in Australia. To be clear, that is not 60% of the submarine build, the threshold the government itself had identified as a local build, but 60% of the contract value. Now, under questioning by Labor, Linda Reynolds was forced to admit that this includes a vast array of ancillary services. Subcontracts with hotels and conference facilities, they're included. Language training with Alliance Francaise, that's included. Travel agents, absolutely included. Money spent with, of all places, the Royal Agricultural and Horticultural Society of South Australia, you better believe it, that's included too. And what does any of that have to do with the nuts and bolts of actually building a submarine in Australia? Well, the answer is obviously absolutely nothing. In January of 2020, we also learned via the Australian National Audit Office that in December of 2018, the Department of Defence had approved the fabrication of hull parts for the first future submarine be undertaken in France. If hull fabrication is being performed in France, it begs the question as to exactly what work will be done in Adelaide. The contract for the build of the first future submarine is yet to be signed. This will be the last opportunity to create a legal commitment on the part of Naval Group to have a specified level of Australian industry content in the future submarines. This is an opportunity that Scott Morrison cannot afford to miss. And so in relation to each of the three key indicators, time, cost and Australian industry content, the Future Submarine Program is going in the wrong direction and fast. The consequences of the failure to manage the Future Submarine Program properly are profound. Australia is now faced with the most wicked problem. We've seen continuing delays in the build from Naval Group. Some issues are obviously beyond the control of anybody, such as the COVID crisis. However, Naval Group is owned by the French government, which has its own priorities in relation to the program of design for its future submarine capabilities. Australia, with its Future Submarine Program, sits somewhere within that order of business. But any thought of ending the contract with Naval Group and pursuing another alternative would obviously be very expensive and involve enormous delay of itself. So the Morrison Government has put Australia's national security between a rock and a hard place. The point at which the fourth future submarine will be operational, which will be the moment that Australia's submarine capability is being predominantly performed by the future submarines, is not expected to occur until about 2040, 20 years away. Now, however long that period of time felt this time last year, in the midst of the coronavirus now, with the implication it has for complicating our strategic circumstances, this period seems like an absolute eternity. Australia is seeking a regionally superior long-range submarine, but there are submarines which are operating in the Indo-Pacific right now which are much faster and have a much longer range than our future submarine will have in 2035. And all of this means we need to extend the life of the Collins class. The 2016 Integrated Investment Program included money to perform a life of type extension for 3 of the Collins boats. Defence is now saying that 5 of the Collins boats will need to be extended, and in all likelihood, this will ultimately apply to all 6. The cost of extending the Collins-class submarines might kindly be described as vague for work that is meant to start in 2026. The recently released 2024 structure plan puts the cost at between $3.5 and $6 billion, an enormous sum and an enormous range, yet still provides no firm details. What we do know is that Defence considers a realistic withdrawal date for the first of the life-extended Collins boats to be 2038. Now, presumably this will be HMAS Collins, which at that point will have been in service for 42 years. If we assume all 6 boats are extended, the last, presumably HMAS Rankin, will be withdrawn in about 2048, after 45 years of service. In other words, 2 decades from now, in the 2040s, Australia's submarine capability will still rely on the Collins class. Submarines conceived in the 1980s, built in the 1990s, and by then in service for over 4 decades. Repeated reports from the ANAO have made clear the highly precarious nature of the Future Submarine Program and its handling. In May of 2018, the ANAO reported that, and I quote, "The Future Submarine Program is highly developmental and does not conform to the government's guiding principles on design maturity." In January this year, the ANAO revealed that the government's hand-picked Naval Shipbuilding Advisory Board had recommended in September of 2018 that Defence examines alternatives should the Strategic Partnering Agreement negotiations falter. And remarkably, the board also expressed a view that Defence should assess whether program risks outweighed the benefits of proceeding with the Future Submarine Program, even if the negotiations succeeded. This is jaw-dropping. And it is the predicament in which the Morrison Government has placed Australia's long-range submarine capability. Now, at this point, let me be crystal clear on a couple of issues. Labor totally supports pursuing the Future Submarine Program because Australia desperately needs modern, best-in-class, long-range submarines for our national security. And none of this should be taken as a criticism of Naval Group. They are a first-rate builder of submarines with a proud history and a superb track record. They certainly have the capability to produce for Australia the long-range submarines that we need. But I do criticise the way in which the Morrison Government has bungled the Future Submarine Program to the enormous detriment of Australia's national security. Since 2016, there have been 40 press releases about the future submarines, the vast bulk from Christopher Pyne as both the Minister for Defence Industry and the Minister for Defence. Now, there's no shortage of hoopla then from the Morrison Government about its brilliant capacity to deliver for Australia the most astonishing future submarine on time, on budget and Aussie built. In fact, you could hardly move for being drowned in the avalanche of press releases and being trampled by the most fabulous circus surrounding the celebration of their announcements. But now, with the Future Submarine Program in trouble, there is no proper explanation at all from Linda Reynolds about how this program will be successfully delivered, and the future submarines are certainly not Scott Morrison's favourite topic either. The Morrison Government goes big on rhetoric, but is a complete failure on delivery. Recently, there has been much muscular language used by Morrison Government MPs about Australia's relationship with China. Well, it's not helped our relationship with China, and it's done nothing to improve Australia's strategic circumstances. Yet when it comes to the management of a program, which done properly would materially change Australia's ability to engage with the world in a way which would be empowering and would build our sovereignty and give us more choices about our strategic circumstances, all we have from this government is one giant fiasco. So let me be completely clear. Because of the way this Liberal government has governed, because of Scott Morrison's Prime Ministership, Australians are less safe. Our national security has been profoundly compromised. Australia now has a major problem in relation to the single most important military platform that this country possesses. Scott Morrison's Liberals have failed Australians with our national security. Submarines are just one example of how the Morrison Government has failed when it comes to operationalising its commitments. Construction proper on the future frigates has already been delayed by the government by 2 years to 2022 to ameliorate risk. Defence has now added the future frigates as a project of interest due to its strategic importance, but also its cost and schedule risks. It's also clear that there are significant design issues, and the recently released 2020 Force Structure Plan has revealed that what was touted as a $35 billion program just 2 years ago is now a $45.6 billion program, a 30% increase. The massive increase in cost has reportedly come not as a result of building more frigates or speeding up the build process, but in fact to slow down the build process. And beyond defence, in the handling of the coronavirus, the Morrison Government was initially reluctant to put in place a wage subsidy, resulting in massive queues outside Centrelink offices, unlike anything Australia has seen since the Great Depression. It was only because Labor urged the government to put in place a wage subsidy that the government moved to implement JobKeeper. But when it did, the scheme saw 870,000 Australians paid on average $550 a fortnight, more than what they had earned before the coronavirus hit. While small businesses were going up in flames all over the country, others received an unexpected windfall to the tune of $6 billion in just 6 months. On an annualised basis, this is the equivalent of the entire pharmaceutical benefit scheme. The Morrison Government introduced an app for case tracing the coronavirus, costing $2 million to build and $70 million to spruik. To date, this app has only traced a handful of cases. Given the horror bushfire season this country just experienced and the stark warning it should have sounded about the need for better preparedness, it is staggering the government has failed to distribute a single cent from the $200 million emergency response fund that Labor helped it establish. The robo-debt scheme has resulted in the Morrison Government repaying more than $700 million to 470,000 people who are unlawfully sent false notices of payment to the Commonwealth Government. In effect, this represents the biggest settlement of a class action in Australia's history. The Morrison Government has made an art form of talking the biggest game Australia has ever seen. Indeed, at times, the Prime Minister has seen the coronavirus as an opportunity to do a victory lap around the country. Yet when it comes to the doing, this is a government which repeatedly fails. And it fails in relation to the two areas which it would claim as its conceit: economic management and national security. Just look at the scoreboard. Australia has unemployment at an effective rate, according to the Treasurer, of 11%. Australia has accrued about the same level of debt as we did to fight the First World War. And we are in recession for the first time in almost 3 decades. Yes, Australia is going through a crisis, but when the Rudd Labor government managed Australia's affairs through the global financial crisis, we put in place targeted stimulus, which was opposed by the Liberals, and managed to keep the economy growing while continuing to generate jobs. By contrast, during the COVID-19 crisis, the Morrison government has failed on jobs, failed on debt, and failed on growth. And when it comes to national security, the Morrison government has monumentally failed to manage the single most important national security project on its watch, namely the Future Submarine Program. The COVID-19 crisis has placed Australia at a crossroads. It will bring about the most significant reimagining of our country since the Second World War. Australia needs leadership which will take us forward with prosperity and enhance our national security. Yet on every measure, Scott Morrison is failing. The Liberals are not fit to govern for this future. When tested, they fail. When pushed, they falter. When questioned, they lecture. So whenever you hear that Scott Morrison is doing a good job, start with the Future Submarines and go down the list from there. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. I'll get to a question about speech in a moment, but first, just for the audience's sake and for those watching at home, I'd just like you to give us an example of the hoops that you had to get through to be here. You were wearing a mask here earlier. You didn't need to do that, but you are wearing that. Just tell us what you've gone through.
Yeah, well, it has been something of a process, Sabra. So I suppose from a legal point of view, the first thing was a requirement to get a medical exemption from the Australian Capital Territory to be here now to make this speech. So we applied for and received that. That exemption allowed me to come here last night, spend the night, but only one night. So the exemption requires me to leave the Territory later this afternoon. I also have applied for and received a permit from the Government of New South Wales to traverse New South Wales by car. That permit stays live, I think, until tomorrow, but I can assure New South Wales I'll be out of the state by tonight. To be honest, I was driven here, which allows me to do work on what is 15 hours worth of driving, but I was only able to get one permit, so I didn't have a permit for one of my staff. So what that meant was that a Victorian-based staff member drove me to the border, dropped me off there. I was then picked up by a Canberra-based staff member who drove me there. And
so
tonight,
you walked across the border?
Well, in fact, tonight I will be doing that. I will be dropped on the New South Wales side of the border. I will take my trundle bag and walk across the bridge, across Checkpoint Charlie, and then I will get to be picked up on the other side by the person who will be looking out for me, and driven home tomorrow. I'll be spending tonight in Wodonga. So it is a bit of a... Having said that, you know, I mean, I've been able to work while I've been driving, and as I said at the outset, this is important. I mean, our democracy needs to continue in the midst of this crisis, and democracies around the world are having exactly the discussion about how they continue their operations in the midst of a crisis such as this. And it's really important to understand that part of our capacity to be dealing with this in a way where we do so well is the fact that we are a democracy. And so, you know, the functions of it have been acknowledged by government, state and federal, as being essential. Like those of us who work in Parliament are essential service workers, and that's as it should be, because it's really critical that the elements of our democracy continue through this period.
Now, defence typically enjoys bipartisan support, but just picking out some of the phrases from your speech: one giant fiasco, Australians are less safe, national security has been profoundly compromised. This feels like one big shot across the government's bow. You also said that the decision to select the one company to build the Future Submarines was negligent. Was it corrupt?
I'm not going there. I don't think I would say that, but it was negligent. And I think the point I do make is that I think politics ruled the day. I think the reason why the down selection occurred at the time that it occurred in the lead up to the 2016 federal election was about trying to sell a political message to, I think, firstly the people of South Australia, but to the people of Australia as well. And in the process, politics trumped what was in the national interest. And I guess to your broader point, Sabra, you're right. The defence has enjoyed bipartisan support, and it's not a small thing to make the decision to make the speech in the way that I have. But, you know, I after a lot of consultation with people that I trust around Australia, feel that this is a moment where it is absolutely essential that this now be called out. Because the fact of the matter is that our national security has been profoundly compromised. I mean, it is the most significant platform that we have in terms of shaping our strategic circumstances and empowering our nation, not just in respect of defence, but in the way in which we engage with the world in every respect. Like, they matter. This is hard power. And a huge mistake has been made, and it's impacting the way in which we relate to the world, and it needs to be said.
Ben Packham.
Thanks for your speech, Mr. Marles. You mentioned China in there and said that the Morrison Government hasn't helped our relationship with China with its muscular language. You went on a study trip to China with China Matters last year. You said you came away with a new perspective on the country. I'm wondering what that perspective tells you about recent events in Hong Kong, about China's trade sanctions on Australia, its denunciation of Australia as a racist country, and ongoing Chinese-sponsored cyber attacks against Australia and other countries. What would Labor do differently to the Morrison Government on China, and how would you manage the strategic challenges posed by that relationship?
Well, firstly, what I'm referring to in terms of the muscular language is language used by a number of government MPs who really are on the fringe. You know, at times I think you get inconsistent messages actually in terms of the strength of the language which is being used by those who we need to be hearing from, namely the Foreign and Defence Ministers and the Prime Minister himself. And so I don't actually think you get a consistent position in relation to that. And that speaks to the fact that I do think this is a fundamentally critical relationship to our nation which has been poorly handled, and poorly handled over the period of this government. So firstly, in terms of answering your question, what would we do differently? Well, what we'd do is have a clear set of guiding principles about how we relate to China, which is a deeply complex relationship. you will not be able to hear a government MP, not the Foreign Minister, the Prime Minister or the Defence Minister, stand here and articulate to you what are their guiding principles in terms of the way in which they are seeking to manage their relationship with China. And the second point is that whilst our professional diplomats do an incredible job, the diplomacy at a political level has been singularly hopeless. And it really has been. I mean, we're 7 years into this government and there is not one relationship of significance which exists between a Morrison Government minister and a senior member of the Chinese government. This is our largest trading partner. I mean, whatever you think about China, it is clearly a relationship that matters, and they don't have one single personal relationship in place, not one. Now, you wouldn't have been able to say that about the Rudd and Gillard governments. You wouldn't have said it about the Howard government. I mean, the truth is that Alexander Downer throughout that period had a lot of significant relationships with those in the Chinese government, and you certainly wouldn't have said it about the Hawke and Keating governments. But this government uniquely has found itself in a position where it can't talk to our largest trading partner. Now, there are times, it's a complex relationship. It is not one which lends itself to saying that we should be, hardline all the time or accommodating all the time. The truth is you need to have an adult, sensible, nuanced, evolved sense of how you're going to manage the relationship. And this mob simply don't have it, and they don't give expression to it. And so that is at the heart of the issue here. And as a result, what we're seeing is the trade relationship being significantly impacted. Like, it's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs, which are at stake at a time when we are in recession for the first time in 30 years. So when we get through the coronavirus, there are going to be a whole lot of workers in this country which wake up with a really rude shock about what our trading situation is with our largest trading partner. So I think all of that is a major problem.
Would Labor have made those statements recently, though, for example, on the South China Sea or Hong Kong?
Well, when it comes to the South China Sea, Ben, I actually think we have spoken with a more robust and a more clear voice than the government. Like, I'd be the first to say this: China presents a whole lot of challenges for Australia's national interests. China presents a whole lot of challenges for Australia's national interest. And we must have the space within our relationship and the courage to express our voice when it differs from Chinese action. And the South China Sea is a perfect example of that. So when you want to find a political party which has consistently been talking about the need to have freedom of navigation operations on the table, it's Labor. It's not the people who are running the country right now, it's Labor. Because that exercises our core interests. 60% of Australia's trade goes through the South China Sea. As an island trading nation, we are deeply invested in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and any attempt to take that out of being in place absolutely goes to our core interests. So we speak about that. But what we don't do is have people on the fringe out there writing opinion pieces which are comparing China to the rise of Nazi Germany. And that's what they've been doing, and that doesn't help. So a clear voice is what you need. And actually you've been getting it from Labor, you haven't got it from this mob.
Lani Scarr.
Lani Scarr from the West Australian. Thank you for your speech. One decision that has been the subject of much speculation and been delayed is the future of full cycle docking. If you were Defence Minister, would you like it in WA or South Australia, or a combination of both? And why do you think it's been constantly delayed?
So that an admirable job asking that question from the West Australian. Look, again, the honest answer to this is that it's tied up with the fate of the Future Submarine Program, and it is in this sense. For those who would make the argument of moving full cycle docking from Adelaide to Perth, it goes along the basis that there won't be the workforce available in one city to do both the work on full cycle docking and ultimately extending the life of Collins whilst also building the future submarines. But what is clear right there is then how the progress of work in respect of the future submarines is going is critical to whatever decision you make in relation to full cycle docking. Now, the nature of submarines is such that uniquely almost it's information which rightly is held in the hands of the government and is not in the public domain. So it's an unsatisfying answer that I'm about to give you, but the short answer is I don't know. And there is no way I could possibly know, because this is government, this is information held by them. But what I do know is this: they have, in their failure to make a clear decision in relation to the fate of full cycle docking, I think done an enormous injustice to workers in both Adelaide and Perth by not giving them certainty. I mean, there are workers right now in Osborne who are in a high degree of stress about the future of their job. And indeed, those in WA who are looking to this opportunity are also in a state of limbo. And it's not good enough to leak out a few lines to get a run in a piece that's buried in the middle of the paper and pretend that is action. Well, that's actually what the government's been trying to do in terms of making a decision. They were going to make this decision by the end of last year. The end of last year. It's August. Like, they need to make a clear decision, and it is absolutely tied up with the progress of the future submarines, and that's why we need to hear from Scott Morrison or Linda Reynolds standing right here explaining to the Australian people what's going on with future subs, because that will answer the question that you've just asked.
Andrew Green.
Richard Marles, Andrew Green from the ABC. You spent a lot of time criticising the Future Submarine Program and the approach there. If I can take you to Australian industry content generally, what does Labor intend on doing to keep the government to account on various policies in that area? Do you accept that there's not a lot you can do once these projects are signed? And why has it taken so long for this criticism to emerge?
Well, let me deal with the last bit. I mean, because it's a very good question. And it really goes to the first question that Sabra asked on defence, which is that we don't take lightly the criticism that we've just engaged in terms of the government in relation to defence. It's not how we would like things to be. There should be a place of bipartisanship. And we've really stuck to that for as long as we think we responsibly can. But we're at a point now where this thing needs to be spoken about and where this needs to be put out there. So if there has been a delay in us making this criticism, it has been about trying to give the government an opportunity to fix this, but they ain't. They are not. And so it is at a time now where we need to make this criticism. In terms of Australian industry content, I think there's a couple of points I'd want to make there. The failure to get a contractual commitment with Naval Group around a specified level of Australian industry content for the Future Submarine Program is all about the fact that they down-selected too early and they were not in a position of bargaining power which enabled them to achieve that. But that is a massive issue. I mean, it's an issue in terms of jobs in South Australia. It is a complete breach of faith for the workers of South Australia that this government is now sending hull fabrication on the first future submarine to France. Well, that is a breach of faith, no question. There is one opportunity which comes with the signing of the build contract. So to briefly explain this, you have the strategic partnering agreement, which sits the whole of the program, but underneath that there are a number of specific contracts, and the next contract to be signed is in relation to the actual construction and build of the first future submarine. In that contract is the last opportunity to get a legal commitment out of Naval Group to have a specified level of Australian industry content for the Future Submarine Program, and that is an opportunity that Scott Morrison must not miss. I mean, it's absolutely essential that he gets that commitment into that agreement.
Can anything be done to make companies meet commitments that they did during a bid phase once they've won that project?
Well, the law can, and so so if you can get it as a legal commitment, that'll help. More than help. That should ensure it. But the issue here is this: how you manage it in terms of when you. How long you keep competition in play and when you ultimately down-select to one, and clearly you do need to down-select to one at some point in time because only one person's going to build the submarines or one company. But the moment at which you do that is fundamental to ensuring that you have the bargaining power to get these things into legal contracts. And that's why the mistake that was made by Malcolm Turnbull and Christopher Pyne back in April of 2016 is so profound. Like, it is a mistake of enormous proportions. And everything that we have seen now flows from that original mistake, because it absolutely compromised our ability to have any say and power in the negotiation process with Naval Group going forward.
Anthony Galloway.
Thank you for the speech. Just to go back to your trip to China last year, you told an audience in Beijing that on the China relationship, we must seek to build it, and not just in economic terms, but also through exploring political cooperation and even defence cooperation. Now, a lot has happened in the world since September last year. I was just wondering, do you think it's still tenable to explore defence cooperation with China in today's world?
Look, I stand by those comments. I do. And one of the reasons why I stand by those comments is because one of the only places where there remains high-level contact between Australia and China is in the military realm. We have an annual dialogue between our Chief of Defence Force and theirs, which is continuing. It's probably the highest level engagement between the two nations right now. So in fact, the military-to-military relationship is the one place where we actually do have contact. And it's the reason why I made that comment. Now, it's not, like, we shouldn't overblow this. Exercise Pandaroo is a small exercise which is about building trust between China and Australia through defence, a cooperative defence exercise. I think that is a useful exercise, and that should continue. But let me make it also clear what I said in that speech in China, so that we're clear about what needs to be done in terms of actually living your actions. In that speech in Beijing, I raised the question of the Uyghur minority and criticised China for their handling of them. In that speech in Beijing, I raised the question of Hong Kong and the way in which China was acting in relation to that. So it's really important that you have the courage to express our national interest and to raise questions of human rights, even in China, even when that differs from what China wants. And that was no small feat, in the sense, China are obviously not happy about the fact that I did that. But that's why this is a relationship which needs to be managed by the adults in the room. And right now, the adults, such as they exist with the government, are asleep. And they are leaving the field vacant to fringe dwellers on the government side who, in my view, are doing significant damage to what is a critical relationship for this country.
Well, just on that, I believe you're referring to an anti-Chinese influenced group called the Wolverines in Parliament. They also have Labor members, so what would a Labor government do to ensure so-called muscular language wasn't put forward by government MPs if it was a Labor government? Well,
I think it's extraordinary, and it didn't happen under the Howard government. It really didn't happen under the Howard government, that you've got a situation where most of what you hear from the government in relation to our most significant relationship is being expressed by backbenchers. Like, would Alexander Downer have ever allowed that? That's what's going on right now. In every government that we've seen in recent memory, like a serious government in this country, foreign policy is determined by the foreign minister and the prime minister, and it's their voice that is heard and that matters. But right now, you're not hearing from them. Like, you're hearing from all these fringe dwellers who are making extraordinary comments. And let's be clear what's at issue. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs in this country. So that's what we would do differently. What you would be hearing in terms of an articulation of Australian policy in respect of China is firstly a set of guiding principles which explain what we're trying to do. And secondly, you'll hear one voice, the voice of the leadership of the government in relation to our relationship with China.
Pablo Vinales.
Pablo Vinales, SBS News. Thank you for your speech. Just further on your first question on the South China Sea, and last week you said before Osmin, everything should be on the table, including freedom of navigation. You've reaffirmed that today. Given that Australia has resisted those calls for now, do you think that would warrant a rethink if such a request were made under a Biden administration?
So let me be really careful in answering this because the detail here matters. It is impossible from opposition to give an opinion about, if you like, an operational call. So a freedom of navigation operation actually should be a matter that is very routine. freedom of navigation operations are deeply in Australia's national interest because we are an island trading nation. Australia is an island trading nation. Like, it goes to the core of who we are. That's why we're in the Straits of Hormuz. But it's certainly why we should be asserting the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in the South China Sea, where most of our trade traverses. So as a matter of principle, I think these things should be on the table, which is what we can say from opposition. In government, as to whether you are asked to engage in a particular freedom of navigation operation at a particular time in a particular way, that ultimately is something that can only be answered if you're sitting in the chair. So what we've been clear to say is, our view is, as a matter of principle, this should be something that is on the table. As in respect of any particular request from the United States, well, it obviously depends on the request, and it depends on the details of the request. So it's difficult to answer from opposition. Well, impossible, actually.
Just getting back to the speech that you did deliver in Beijing, extracts of that were given to the media at the time. Will you release the full text of the speech that you delivered?
Well, I stand to be corrected, but I'm pretty sure the full text of the speech is available, and the answer is yes, but I think we already have.
Sure, we'll double check that soon.
Yeah, we have.
Daniel Hurst.
Mr Marles, Daniel Hurst from Guardian Australia. The Defence Strategic Update that the government released recently pointed again to the importance of the relationship between the US and China in terms of the strategic dynamics in our region. Where do you see the landing point for the tensions between US and China, like in Australia's interests? And is the Australian government doing enough to assert Australia's interests? Are you satisfied with what the ministers did last week in Washington?
That's a really good question. I suppose there are a few things you can say. Firstly, the world obviously looks a lot safer and more secure and more certain from where we sit, when the relationship between China and the US is going well. And there are implications from making that observation. I mean, if that's right, well then obviously, whilst at the core of our national security and the core of our foreign policy outlook is our alliance with the United States, and I'm a firm and deep believer in that, it also stands to reason that from that place we should be building the best political relationship that we can, and trade relationship with China, and saying that whilst there are obviously issues that are challenging, and we will have the courage to stand up and speak for Australia and our national interest, even when it diverges from Chinese action, and that we do, as a member of the international community, reserve the right to speak up around human rights matters, and we in a sense, give that judgment in the spirit of submitting ourselves to judgment, which is what it is to be in the international community. Having said all of that, obviously the relationship with China starts from a place where we value it. Because what are we saying if we don't? When we're talking about, our largest trading partner. So I think it is, that sense of principles is something that we need to be able to articulate better as a nation, which can guide us irrespective of what ultimately ends up being the landing point in the relationship between China and the US. And the final point I'm making in relation to your question is, because of the uncertainty of where we're at now, and we do live in a very, very uncertain world, it speaks to the complexity of our strategic relationships and, if you like, the importance, therefore, of Australia having the capacity to be able to play bigger on the international stage, in a diplomatic sense, but in a defence sense. And that's where you get back to future submarines. Like, when you're looking at hard power, which actually enables you to have more choices in the way in which you engage with the world and to play bigger, managing a program of this kind is where it's at. And this government is failing. So I don't actually, I don't have issue with how both ministers performed in Washington in the last few weeks, but I do think the way in which this government is going, and particularly in managing this program, is absolutely undermining our ability to deal with the kind of very difficult strategic circumstances that you've just described.
We're almost at time, but since you've come a long way to give this speech, I don't think you'll mind taking a couple more questions. Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Barbara. Tim Shaw, Richard Marles, Director of the National Press Club. You've spoken about cost, you've spoken about local content, and you've certainly spoken about delays. You could be the next Defence Minister in just over a year, federal election. How do you, in a bipartisan way, where Labor and the Coalition have worked so strongly together on the defence of the nation, how do you get this ball started earlier? Because, you know, we're still running around with submarines with diesel engines and lead-acid batteries, when in a world of technology, nuclear and lithium battery. I mean, how do you get that conversation going now? Because you could be the person facing the same criticism about this problem in over a year's time. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and one that there isn't a neat answer to. You know, like there is bipartisanship around the need for us to have 12 future submarines built in this country. And there's bipartisanship now, given how things have played out, around Naval Group building them. Because given the criticism, I've made the criticism and I make it strongly, and it's put us in a very difficult situation. But if you assess, okay, well, given all that, where are we now at this moment and how do we move forward? You know, Naval Group are a fair way down the track. They should continue to build this. We need to be doing everything we can, I think, to try and improve our position within that relationship. It's pretty difficult in terms of the circumstances this government's put us in, but we need to do that. So there is bipartisanship across that. But I think we are at a point now where the conversation is advanced in our nation's interest by actually pointing the stuff out that I have in this speech today. By, if you like, being more robust and putting this much more in the public domain. You know, we are a long way down the track. We have given the government not only months but years to get this right, and they haven't. And it is really now time to try and put the kind of pressure that one does in a democracy on this government to actually do something to get this back on track, because I'm telling you, it is absolutely fundamental to our national interest in a way which mightn't seem so obvious, but it absolutely is, and it does go to the prosperity and security of every Australian going into the middle of this century.
Nick Stewart.
Thank you very much for your speech. The US military has now decided it's going to establish a fuel reserve here in Australia. We currently have our national fuel reserve over in America. Would you, if you were elected, would you make a decision that we are going to have all the fuel reserve here?
Well, we've been very clear, and we were going into the last election, and we remain very clear, and indeed Anthony has been critical of the way in which the government has gone about its handling of the question of our fuel security. We've been very clear that this is a situation which is unsatisfactory and we need to improve it, and we really do. It's not going to happen overnight. And we need to be looking at every way in which we can get our fuel security up to a point where, you know, we do have the sovereign capability in this domain that we require. Can I say what was announced in Washington in respect of what the US is going to do in terms of its infrastructure build in Darwin is a great thing. We support that. It'll be very helpful. It is not a panacea. Like if the government is out there trying to say this solves our fuel security issue, well, it doesn't. I mean, it's helpful, but there's a long way to go. So
a simple commitment, 100% yes or no?
Well, in this space, the world is not simple. So that's the answer to your question.
Pretty simple, yes or no?
It's not.
Yes or no?
It's not simple. Given the situation that this government has placed us in. But what we will be doing is everything we can to make sure that we improve our fuel security and our sovereign capability that goes with that.
Thank you. And on that note too, I've just been sent a link to a date and a time as to when the transcript of your speech was sent out in Beijing.
Great.
So thank you. Everybody, please join me in thanking Richard Marles.